Awesome. Thank you for that, Ron. In terms of the agenda today, we'll start with a brief introduction if you haven't heard of Trend Micro recently, a bit of where we've been in the past 30 or so years. Not that I've been there that long. I've only been with the company for 5 years or so. But in Trend Micro's time, we've done a lot again. A lot of these slides I'm clicking through right now are niceties for if you choose to download the deck after today's webinar, if you want to review some of the information about Trend Micro. I will point out I'm especially proud of the bottom left statistic there. If you've ever heard of the 0-Day Initiative, this is the world's largest vendor-agnostic bug bounty program. And as a result of Trend Micro's research arm, that has made us #1 in public vulnerability disclosure, and we use that threat data to inform how we can better enable our products to meet a variety of use cases, both in the cloud and elsewhere. In terms of the customer base, again, I'll click right through this. This is for after webinar review. And in terms of the overall trend solution, a lot of conversations I like to have about security focus on risk and the risks inherent to the different potential attack surfaces, whether that is at the end user or in email, or as we'll mainly talk about today, within cloud operations, in our cloud native architecture, in our hybrid cloud environments, and in that migration process from one to the other. So when we talk about business value, the growth and opportunity that comes from going cloud native, we see here a brief kind of summary of growth curves for business value. And you'll see here the cloud native curve is naturally quicker to provide value throughout the process, but we can only start working in cloud native architecture after we continue to retire and eventually finish retiring all of the existing tech debt through migration to a cloud vendor of our choice. And a lot of this talk is going to be talking through that cloud journey. And in the interest of time, I'll build out all of the animations here and understanding where security needs to fit during this migration process. And there are a lot of sticking points. We'll talk about individual services, what they mean in terms of shared responsibility, and then the overarching theme of making sure that whether we are migrating to the cloud or building cloud natively, we keep our projects with compliance and security in mind. So this was alluded to during Cheryl's presentation, but when it comes to our utilization of a cloud platform, or more specifically, a platform as a service, there is an inherent shared responsibility model, whether you're working in AWS, in Microsoft Azure, GCP, and it's up to us as users of those platforms to understand where we are expected to provide security past what's either already done by the cloud provider or is achievable from the cloud native consoles. I skipped over an introduction of myself. For the past 2 years at Trend Micro, I've been working with the AWS Alliances team. So what that means is in my day-to-day processes, I work with architects like Cheryl and with all of you, hopefully, to understand that as you move to AWS, where security may be required in your applications and in your cloud projects, especially when those needs and requirements are driven by a shared responsibility model in security. So in terms of service exploration, as you might have seen in the agenda slide, I'm going to start by talking about S3 buckets you'll see in the title, but these requirements for security apply to any sort of cloud object storage you may be using. And we'll explore security across cloud object storage in a variety of positions throughout the cloud migration journey. Because the humble storage bucket, or storage container, storage repository, storage account, if you're working in Azure, can play several different roles during cloud migration and cloud adoption that will each require unique approaches to provisioning security, so that way it scales with our application usage. So we have on screen the 6 common requirements for securing S3, and the first 5 are actually accomplishable within the AWS console for S3. It turns out that number 6, in this case, cannot be achieved within the AWS console, and that's validating all of the objects passing into our S3 bucket environment for any kind of malicious code or software. And it's important to note, if we think back to the shared responsibility model, because these S3 buckets or these storage environments are part of our application, and they can host application data assets, logic, and code, or hold any kind of user information, we have to meet all of these requirements, not only for kind of AWS well-architected compliance, but to other third-party frameworks as well. PCI DSS requirement 5, as an example, states that every part of a given cloud system needs to either prevent or detect and address malicious objects. And of course, with system being such a wide encompassing term, this also applies to cloud object storage. So we'll take a look at an offering from Trend Micro called File Storage Security. It has a lot of great documentation around it. I will focus on the fact, on this slide at least, that it detects files, or rather, it detects malicious software, files of any type or size in all of the major cloud object storage players, right? S3 buckets, Azure Storage Accounts, GCP. In terms of how we could extend, starting with project cloud maturity, file storage security, here we have Smart Streams TLM on-demand application. This is a SaaS application that SmartStream offers to intake, you'll see on the left-hand side here, transactional files from all of their banking clients before, one, passing them off for any kind of transaction lifecycle management here in the EC2s, in the application layer, and then passing those transactional files to long-term storage in S3 Glacier. And if we think back to, again, that PCI requirement of making sure that this system that you see on the screen now can either prevent or detect and address malicious objects, we'll explore a couple of workflows to accomplish that security. But I want to start by getting security as close to the bucket as possible. So you'll see here with Trend Micro's offering, File Storage Security, we are able to add a malware scanning Lambda function to the S3 bucket in terms of availability of the application, workflow, usage of the application. There is no noticeable change to the operations team, to the end user. All that we're doing in a project-based deployment is making sure that the application can continue to operate as intended with an added layer of security overhead. So now, as part of the workflow, before objects are passed from the intake S3 bucket to processing in the EC2 instances, we could potentially copy any malicious files over to a quarantine environment for investigation, move them out entirely, so that way they are separate from the workflows of the EC2s or from long-term storage in S3, and making sure that we don't accidentally process anything that is unintended as part of the application workflow. So this is a basic deployment and an exploration of file storage security in a very initial approach to cloud migration. And I mean cloud migration, obviously this is built in AWS, but cloud migration from a security standpoint. If we want to think past the project phase, we can think of the exact same security service, file storage security in this case, but apply it at the use case level. And what I mean by that is making sure that the security is in place, not just at the bucket, but is able to scale or meet multiple use cases within a single product. And by making sure that this security deployment remains flexible, as our S3 buckets take on different roles throughout our cloud migration process, that they stay secure the entire time. So here we have an example hybrid cloud migration. Again, we're going to focus on security of the source migration bucket. So if we're moving on-premise, or rather from on-premise to the AWS cloud, and we want to use a service like AWS Data Sync to move some of our on-premise databases into S3, we find that we can transfer the objects, right, one-to-one, and we want to have that lifecycle management. We want to have that object retirement into a service like Glacier long-term. If we have our file storage security environment, we have security in place as our migration bucket serves multiple jobs, from being the source, right, the destination of our migration from on-prem via data sync. And then if down the line we point a different AWS service at the exact same bucket, like storage gateway, we now have the ability to use the exact same bucket with the same security stack, scanning objects the entire time. As we move our applications from on-premise to the cloud, our storage from on-premise to the cloud, our migration serves multiple jobs, but has security in place the entire time. So that's a little bit about what I mean by securing at the use case level. We want to make sure that if we have a service in mind that needs to be secured, like EC2, like S3 buckets, that if we think of all of the overarching systems that connect to that system downstream, that our security can meet those needs as the overhead upstream architecture continues to evolve for our business use case. So that's a migration use case, right? Our S3 bucket serving a multifaceted role in a migration scenario. Let's think about reinvention in the cloud. Again, a lot can be drawn from the humble cloud object storage here. So let's say that we have a project fully realized, fully cloud native in AWS, or again, in your cloud provider of choice, that is working with ephemeral storage. Our S3 buckets are going to host any kind of user data, any kind of upload in an interim period. And then if we're working serverlessly, we might very well have all of that architecture deprovision, essentially implode when the invocation of that serverless function is done occurring. So as a result, we don't want to have those S3 buckets lingering around and piling up over time if they're alive past their usefulness. So when we think of flexibility and we think of scaling the exact same security solution to meet a storage use case in a more cloud-native development, let's make sure that we keep security in mind for this flexibility. The ability to, on the event of a new bucket creation, scaling our security to meet the provisioning of that new bucket. So that way, during the life cycle of that bucket, while it's alive, we scan objects coming into it. And then once that serverless function is finished and the invocation ends, and that S3 bucket is therefore no longer needed, upon deletion of that bucket, we also continue to delete our security stacks when they're no longer necessary. So this has been an exploration, just to one service in AWS or to your cloud vendor of choice, object storage. And if we can pinpoint how, or rather what the role of that service is in our cloud migration journey, we can hopefully better understand how we need security to scale and be architected to meet that part of our cloud adoption story. So if we extend this case study to other services outside of object storage, here we have a couple of quotes, or rather one quote by Chaitanya Pinnamaneni, the CTO of Sandstone Technology, again, a great partner of Trend Micro. He found that the best value in our Cloud One platform, of which file storage security, the service I've been talking about, is one piece. He found it helpful to have a single dashboard solution that protected their cloud databases, their infrastructure, and delivered compliance reports on their 30-day reporting cycle. So the use case here is to have scalable security for their serverless functions, for their server instances, and to maintain visibility of their entire AWS environment as they scale out. So let's think back to integrating at the use case level. If we think of a service like AWS Control Tower, and to be more specific, Account Factory in AWS Control Tower, if we have security in place that can scale at the speed of new account provision in AWS, we are then able to offer a couple of things. In this version of the integration, we have workload security from Trend Micro and conformity being built off of that integration to AWS Control Tower. And from conformity, we're able to offer that continuous visibility of new AWS accounts and all of the architecture and infrastructure that we provision, not only in AWS, but also in Azure and GCP. And then applying compliance checks on any kind of schedule or programmatically across cloud native frameworks like the AWS well-architected framework, and then ones that might be relevant to your organization like PCI. If we find we have to conduct a biweekly, monthly audit of our cloud services and our cloud systems for PCI compliance, we can do that and understand how to remediate any potential miscompliances with a tool like conformity. Additionally, and I'll build this slide out as well, for our EC2 instances or for our compute, we can have something like workload security in place. And again, thinking to the use case, if we use a service over EC2, like SSM, like State Manager, to watch for new deployments of EC2 instances informed by CloudWatch, we can then automate the deployment of security to those EC2 instances. So when Cheryl, as an example, was talking about the scalability in AWS across AZs, across regions for your banking applications, we can keep security in lockstep with that deployment. As an example, here is SmartStream's TLM application from earlier. You can see if we don't want to architect security at the S3 bucket, or maybe in addition to that security posture, further downstream, we can also scale our multi-AZ deployment of EC2s, of the actual application data handling, with a security agent like Trend Micro Workload Security across a variety of controls. And it's important to note that this again deploys to all compute types in major players across Azure VMs, EC2 instances, GCP compute. And if we're finding that part of our migration story is having a hard time handling or figuring out what to do with legacy OS, we can deploy something like Cloud One Workload Security to multiple operating systems and offer things like integrity monitoring for files and folders, or virtual patching in the form of intrusion prevention, host-based intrusion prevention, so that way for those legacy OSs that might be past end of support, we can continue to provide patches, virtual patches, to help meet any kind of security risk that might exist on that instance. So I've talked about a few services today: conformity, file storage security, workload security. These are all part of, again, the single platform that is Trend Micro Cloud One. I encourage you to, if you download this presentation a little bit later, to head to the link down there to learn more about the platform. Or if you want to explore any kind of workshop material, maybe you're more of a hands-on type of learner, we've written several workshops. I believe we have 6 or 7 now, written in conjunction with AWS, that will help you understand how to, 1, use the AWS service, and 2, provide security to it. Again, obviously, as part of the partnership with Trend Micro, but the concepts and the learnings that you can take from these workshops apply to whatever security strategy you might have in your cloud provider of choice going forward.